right, what are we learning about? All right. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
We leave off. We left off 9 lines. Okay, good. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Shabbos Daf Kuf Mem Ches. We just finished on Daf Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Beis the story with Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, and as we explained, that he is known as the Mayon HaMizgaber. That means that his connection to Chachma was very powerful, and his Lefi Erkoi involvement, engagement, indulgence in certain physicality, pleasures of this world, disconnected him a little bit from that level of Chachma, which is tak indeed why in Pirkei Avos he says, Ve'el binoscha al tishain. It's not enough to have bina, you have to have Chachma. And what disconnected him, and how did we find out, as we learned in the story, that when he was called up to the Torah after that event, after his moving away temporarily from his Chavedim, so instead of reading the words HaChodesh Hazel Lochem, he read it as HaChodesh Hoya Libam. And what letters did he change? The inner letters, the Pnimiusdika letters, which represents the highest level, the Chachma part. And further than that, he replaced the Dalid, the Zayin, and the Chaf with the letters Reish Yud Veis, which makes the word Riv, Riv Umeriva. Riv means some sort of fight, some sort of disconnect, which is exactly what happened. And then the power of tshuva, or the power of chavedim davening for you, that he right away came back to his old Sheva Yipol Tzadik Bad Vakam. All right, we're going to continue to learn how Shmuel had a different girsa in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we read that if a person broke their bone, then our girsa was that ein machzirin as hashevet. Shmuel's girsa in the Mishnah was that yes, you are allowed to set a broken bone on Shabbos, even though it's not life-threatening. But nevertheless, as we also know, that if you don't set the bone, or if the bone starts to get reset in an unhealthy way, then you gotta break it again. So you are allowed to set it on Shabbos. We're going to start learning, God willing, the new Pedic, the 23rd Pedic, Shoyel. Shoyel means to borrow. And as we will learn that Bechlal, there is an Isser Midrabanan to do any financial dealings on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Number one, that Isser is included in the words of the Navi, that a person has to refrain from pursuing his needs and from speaking words that he speaks in the week. On top of that, there's another fear that Chazal had, that if a person is going to do financial dealings, which includes borrowing, a person might come to write down those transactions, and then he's going to violate an Isur D'Oraisa. Nevertheless, the Mishnah is going to begin telling us that they made certain exceptions, and there are certain financial transactions, speaking about lending, that is allowed to be done on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, if the items that are being borrowed are needed for Shabbos and or for Yom Tov, with all of the details of two types of loans. One is called Shoyel, right? She'eleni. One is called Halveni, as we'll see the difference between them. We're going to be learning that if a person see something that's not supposed to happen, even though, yeah, there's a concept of making a protest, but there is on the other side an inyan that Chazal tell us, Hanach li Yisrael, mutav shiur shoygigin va'aliyu mezidin. And this concept is not only applied on Isura de Rabbanan, but it's also applied on Isura de Raisa, with details of that. We're going to be reviewing the Isur, according to Beis Hillel, of Sa'a B'Sa. Sa'a B'Sa means that if I need a certain product, like I need a saw of grain or a flour to make challah for Shabbos. Beis Hillel holds, I'm not allowed to always borrow from you a saw. And I'll tell you, I'll give you back that saw, commodity for commodity, because maybe in between the time that I borrowed and the time that I'm going to pay back, the price of this commodity will go up. And therefore, even though this is not ribis d'oraisa, right? Ribis d'oraisa is that when I borrow money during the moment of borrowing, I make up that I'm going to be giving you back this plus. No, it's saw for a saw, but it's ribis midrabanan. We're going to see exceptions to that. We're also going to be having a gavaldik machlokes amirayim in the case of the Mishnah, which indeed we are allowed to borrow something on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Speaking about food, question is that a loan that's collectible in Beis Din? And we're going to have Shita of Rabbi Yosef that even though this loan might happen, but it's not allowed to be collected in Beis Din. That means you really have to trust that the borrower will be honest. Nevertheless, as we'll see in the Mishnah, there is a way of guaranteeing, so to say, that you'll get the money paid back. You are allowed to take a mashkin, but also in an unusual way with many other pratim. We're going to learn the Shita of Rabbi Yechanan, that even though it says in the Mishnah that because of a shvus, normally you are not allowed to be magdish an animal on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, says Rabbi Yechanan that if this carbon has to be brought today, it's a chayvas hayom, just like the Torah tells you that certain karbanos are allowed to be brought on Shabbos if hakravasan doicha. So Rabbi Yechanan holds in those cases, then kiddushasan is also doicha and there is no shvuz. All right, let's take off where we left off. We left off on Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Beis by the 2 dots, 9 lines before the bottom of the Amid, right after the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, which is also called Rab Nehoiroi. The Mishnah says, Avoloi misgarerin, that we are not allowed to scrape. This is in the context of vigorously massaging the body, using kalim that really massage the body. Using that keli we spoke out is included in the general rabbinic isur known uvda d'chayil. Says the Gemara Tana Rabbanan, ein goyin in the megredes b'Shabbos, one may not use a keli that used to scrape the body or massage the body on Shabbos. However, if a person's feet, right, that's the way it worked. They had sandals, they didn't have socks, there was no asphalt. If one's feet is very dirty on Shabbos, and these kalim are also very effective in scraping off dirt, then yes, you may use it. In other words, if you're using this keli that it should give you some sort of physical relief, like a massage, that is where they asered uvda d'chayil. But if you're doing it pasha to clean, that is something that you are allowed to do on Shabbos. And Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda of the Le'ime migrarta d'chaspa. The mother of Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda made for him some sort of silver scratcher or silver keli for Shabbos, because she correctly understood that as long as there is a special Shabbos keli for it, it's automatically not uvda d'chayil. How is it uvda d'chayil? If the keli is azil ben shena keli, and therefore he was able to use it as needed. Then the Mishnah said, ein yordim le kordima. So we said kordima is a river. Why may you not go down to this river on Shabbos? Says the Gemara Maitamo mishum pikam. Zot Rashi pikam. Pikam means that you will slip. Says Rashi, tichaloisanor machlik. And who cares if you're going to slip? The issue is that your begadim are going to get drenched with water. And who cares if they'll get drenched with water? Says Rashi, then there were chayshish that you will take it out and wring it out. So now it fits into the hemshech of the Mishnah that we were learning, the whole gezeda about carrying a towel. But don't put yourself in a position where you might be tempted to be oived on schika, which is a tulda of melabing, if it's water in your garment. Then the Mishnah said, ve'ein oisin apictivizin. Apictivizin is a certain type of potion that you would drink that would make you vomit up food. The Shabbos. This isur is ela b'sam. Only if you're drinking something that's making you vomit. But to stick your fingers down your throat, that is mutter. No, even in the weekdays, you may never vomit because you're doing a hefsed. Obviously, the Tanach doesn't agree with that. That's very similar to a machlekes that we already had twice recently, baltashchis, but then we say baltashchis the gufa adif. You can argue both ways. It's taka and hefsed of oichlin, but on the other hand, if it's good for you, if it makes you feel better, well, that's more important. But Rab Nechemia holds that no, it's don't overeat and then brech it out. All of that could be avoided and don't create hefsed oichlin. All right. Now, we had this a few times already in the Masechta. So there's different levels of straightening the limbs of a child. There's a certain point where that's mamish mishum refuah. And then there is the normal, as we'll learn in a moment, it was very common when babies were born, they would wrap the babies around. They would swaddle the babies with a garment to keep them tightly to straighten out some soft bones. That is permitted, as we'll see. So, that lapufe yenuka b'Shabbos, simply wrapping a baby when he or she is born on Shabbos, that's okay. Swaddling is okay. The Gemara, it says in our Mishnah, ein ma'atzvin. So answers the Gemara, no, Hassan meaning us by us in the Mishnah, bechumrei shidra. We're speaking about a person, a baby that's born, the spinal cord, there's the spinal vertebrae, they are disaligned, and aligning them, that's a greater act of refuah. Obviously, all of this is no pikuach nefesh involved. It's something that will have to be done, but you can wait. Since your mom is healing the baby, our Mishnah says you're not allowed to do it. The mechza kabayna. But Rabbi Yochanan was speaking about stam la pufe yenuka was the normal swaddling of a baby. The bones are soft just to make sure everything is aligned, and that is something that is permitted to be done on Shabbos. This is exactly what we are waiting for God. We are the yenuka, and the Eibishter has to make us a la pufe yenuka, swaddling us, wrapping us. This is what the world is waiting for. All right, then the Mishnah says in our version, ve'ein machzirin es hashevet. If someone broke a bone, we may not set the bone on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Amar Rab Chana Bagid Ta'ah. Rab Chana from Baghdad says in the name of Shmuel Daf Kuf Mem Ches, halacha, actually, machzirin es hashevet. You are allowed to set the bone on Shabbos. Now, Shmuel is arguing with the Mishnah. Look inside the top Rashi. Halacha machzirin es hashevet. Sfira leila Shmuel machzirin tran. Now, Shmuel had another girsa in the Mishnah. And now says the Gemara the following. Rabbi Bar Chana, who lived in Eretz Yisrael, he went to Pumpadisa. He went on a trip to Babel. There was the city of Rav Yehuda. However, all the Pirkei de Rav Yehuda. But when Rav Yehuda was giving the drasha, he did not as of yet go there. And Rav Yehuda so much wanted for Rabbi Bar Chana to come, not because he was looking for the kavod, for Rabbi to hear his drasha. No, he wanted to clarify certain halachas with the great Rabbi Bar Chana. But he was unable to go to him because he was giving a class. So what did he do? Shadrei la'ada dayola. He sent his attendant Ada, and Amarlei, Rabbi Yehuda tells Adam, Zil Garbe, go and confiscate, go chop the cloak of Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana is going to look for his cloak, and they'll tell him, I'm sorry, Ada took your cloak. Where is Ada in the Midrash with Rabbi Yehuda? In other words, this was a way of almost grabbing him, schlepping him to the Midrash of Rabbi Yehuda. And Ada disobeyed what Rabbi Yehuda told him. Azil Garbe. What happened? He had no breda. Rabbi Bar Chana needed his cloak. They told him that the attendant of Rabbi Yehuda took it. So Ashkechei Punkt, when Rabbi Bar Chana went into the base medrash of Rabbi Yehuda, he found Rabbi Yehuda the Kadosh that he was learning our Mishnah, and he read the Mishnah the way it says it, the way we have our Girsa. Ein machzirin es hashevet. So when Rabbi Bar Chana hears this, Amalei, he tells Rabbi Yehuda, Hachi Omar Rav Chana Bagdato in the name of Shmuel, that no, the girsa in the Mishnah is, and therefore the halacha is, yes, Machzir Nasa Shevet. And Rabbi Yehuda was so happy. And he tells Rabbi Bar Chana, listen to this. Amalei, ha Chana Didon. Appreciate the fact that Chana Bagdata did not live in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Baghdad. He lived in Bavel. Shmuel also lived in Bavel. And yet, I, Rabbi Yehuda, that I live in Pompadisa, also in Bavel, I never heard what they said. The lav bedina geraftech, so wasn't it justified that I had my attendant sequester you by, so to say, taking your garment? It's good that I did it. You see, it's amazing that you in Eretz Yisrael, you know more of what the Amoraim are saying in Bavel, more than I who live in Bavel. So I needed you to come here. Now that you came here, now I was corrected, and that's a big difference. You know, and he accepted the version in the Mishnah that that Machzir and Shevet, and not only that, but as you can see from the Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, that this is taka the halacha, that if someone had the bone broken on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, God forbid, that we are allowed to set it. Okay. Then the Mishnah says, if something was dislocated, and so doing a technique that will only realign it on Shabbos directly to that limb is asur, and they used to do it then by washing that limb in cold water. Coldness would make something shrivel up, or it's not swollen. They would be able to fix it. But the Mishnah says if you're bathing your entire body in cold water, which was completely mutter, even though again now the minig is not to bathe in cold water, that is something that's okay. So says the Mishnah. Says the Gemara like this. Now, Avya, this story is directly linked to what the sugya that we just learned above, that Shmuel had a different version in the Mishnah. You know what happens when you hear that there's another girsa? It shakes you up, because then maybe the next line is also a wrong version, a different girsa. So Rabbi Avya, Rabbi Yosef, Kamei Rabbi Yosef. Again, Rabbi Yosef here is the Rebbe of Rabbi Avya. And during that shiur, sometime, Shanyo Leyodei, Rabbi Avya's hand became dislocated. And Rabbi Avya now wants to heal himself, but he knows that this might be problematic because certain therapies may not be done on Shabbos. So he began to ask his teacher, can I do this? Can I do that? But appreciate what he did. As he's asking the shaila, he's actually doing it. Amalei, hachi mai, can this type of relocating be done? Again, the Gemara doesn't describe what he did, maybe because it's hard to put it into words, but it's not the point. Because he was asking shailas by demonstrating. So he was actually doing it. Oh, so Rabbi Yosef says, no, this is also, you can't do that on Shabbos. So he says, well, what about something else? Hachi mai, Amalei, this is also asur. So Adahachi, and he asked him so many shailas, and every shaila was he actually demonstrated another therapy. His hand healed. And here Rabbi Yosef got upset with him. Rabbi Yosef felt this is like a harama. Come on, but you didn't know that this cannot be done. I knew that you were asking these questions just, as really in front of my face, what, to heal yourself? Amalei, mighty boy, what was even your havamina? We learned in our Mishnah, you're not allowed to massage them in cold water. In other words, only deal with that limb, which was what he was doing by asking the shailas, demonstrating on only that limb. Avol, what's the bach over here? Avol, roichitz, tevis ela muchakim, because it's not negeya. But okay, let's read it. Avol, roichitz, kedar kivim nesrapa. So Amalei, so Rabbi Avya explains to Rabbi Yosef the reason why I was doing this harama is because I wasn't certain whether we were reading the Mishnah correctly. The Loitanan, didn't we learn in our Mishnah the words Ein Machzir and Shevet? And yet, mitamol, we have a Rab Chana from Bagdata in the name of Shmuel that says Halacha Machzir and Shevet. In other words, all of a sudden, this Mishnah, which normally we never touch the Mishnah, is this Mishnah, we say the girsa we had was wrong. So I thought that just like that statement has to be corrected, maybe the rest also has to be corrected. Which is why I felt that it's okay for me, at least in this way of asking a shaila, to actually do the therapy on each limb. Amalei Rabbi Yosef responds to his student Rabbi Avya, Kula b'chada mechisa machtinu, are all of the statements in the Mishnah woven in the same weave? So if there is a gewaldige exception that one line in the Mishnah and doesn't have the right version, that was it. But all of a sudden you're going to put a question mark in every other statement, it's not all together. Heicha de itmer itmer. Only when we hear clearly from these great Amirayim that the Mishnah's Girsa is wrong, then we accept it. But heicha de itmer, then we have to accept all of the versions that they are correct, is lo itmer, and therefore you should have known that what you are doing is not okay. And with that we say, Hadran Allah, we will return to you, Perek Chavis. Now we are already starting the second to last chapter, chapter Shoyel. Like we mentioned in the intro, financial dealings are generally forbidden to be done on Shabbos and forbidden to be done on Yom Tov. Number one, it's included in the Divrei Kabbalah of Mimitzoi Chafzucha, which means we have to refrain from pursuing our chafatzim. And V'daber Davar, we have to refrain from speaking conversations that we do during the week. Then there is an addition to that, there is a Gzeira, that Shema Yichtoiv, you might write down that transaction. So that's the rule. Now, financial dealings generally would include also lending, borrowing money. However, says the Mishnah, that if on Shabbos you run out of food, if on Yom Tov you run out of food, how many times did we experience on Simchas Torah, right? We ran out of mashkem. And the question is, can you borrow? We're going to learn in Beisa many more pratim, even of buying. Obviously, it's about how you word it. It's about what is being done, but our Mishnah is speaking about borrowing. Says the Mishnah, yes, shoyel adam chaveri. A man is allowed to be shoyel, to borrow from his chaver. Kadeyayin, pitchers of wine, and kadeshemen, pitchers of oil. I just want to explain the following. The word shoyel and the word halva'a generally mean the same thing, but they're not exactly the same thing. She'ela is used when the item that I'm borrowing, that item itself, I plan to return. Obviously, that's not the case over here. There's a reason for that, right? When I borrow wine, I'm drinking your wine. I'm not returning this wine. I'm going to replace it. Replacing is halva'a, like my money. You lent me $100. I'm not going to give you back the same bill. I'm going to replace you. Replace. If I'm doing she'ela on your chair, that's normally where she'ela is used. And b'meila, a type of loan where the item is going to be returned is a loan that the owner knows that whenever he wants, he can ask for it back because it's always going to be be'en. So generally, she'ila is used for a very short-term loan. Halva'a, which is like we mentioned, the word halva'a really means that I'm giving you an item for you to use, and you're going to replace it. So we have, we have the rule, stam halva'a is at least for 30 days. Much more. 30 days is a longer term loan. So the Mishnah says you can be shoyel mechaveri kalyan kadishemen, and the Gemara is going to be medayik. The Mishnah will be medayik shoyel ubelvat shelo yomer loy halveini. Don't use the words lend me, even though that is exactly what's going on. Don't use those words. Use the words she'eleni. And we'll see in the Gemara details why that shinui is necessary. But we can generally understand. We don't want to violate the Isur D'Rabbanan of doing financial dealings. We don't want for people to write it down. And just appreciate that. If something is going to be loaned for a longer amount of time, you write it down. If something is going to be loaned just for a little bit, no one writes it down. So it removes it. Using the word she'ela is almost like a zecher, a reminder, don't write it down. V'chein, another example, isha mechaverta, right? Adam mechaveroi, wine or oil. A woman needs a loaf of bread on Shabbos, for Shabbos. She needs a loaf of bread for Yom Tov. She needs it on Yom Tov. So again, she is allowed to borrow these loaves of bread. Again, more details in the Gemara. Now, what happens if the lender doesn't trust the borrower? You're not writing it down, says the Mishnah, the first white line. Then another step that the Chachamim allowed is manichai talisay etzloi. The borrower is allowed to leave his talis, which is a mashkin, with the lender. Here also, you're not allowed to use the words, here is my mashkin. Don't say those words, the daber davar, but you're leaving a mashkin. And then, now that the lender has something from the borrower, knows exactly how much is owed. The details are not allowed to be verbalized at all on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So you give a picture is not a detail. You give a picture, you give a box. If you are afraid that something will be forgotten and won't be replaced, take a mashkin. Don't use the word mashkin. Don't never say the words halveini. You can only use the words of she'ilah, and these shenuyim were opened up for Tzleirach Shabbos and Yom Tov. And V'chein, says the Mishnah, another example, Erev Pesach in Yerushalayim that turns out to be on Shabbos, just like we may not lend on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. We may not buy on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Mikach u'memkar. Mikach u'memkar is also asur midrabanan. Let's say because we're going to write it down. So here, there's a Koren Pesach that I woke up the last moment. It's already Shabbos. I have to buy into a group's Koren Pesach because you can only fulfill your mitzvah if before the shechita you were counted in that animal. So I'm buying it. I'm not paying the money, but I'm saying I got to be part of it. Now, after Yom Tov, really not only after Shabbos, it's already, because the next day is Yom Tov. It's the first day, Chol HaMoed, is the first time that they will be able to come and ask payment from me. So they're also, they don't trust that I'm going to pay. We might forget, nothing is written down. So they're also, maniach talei. I, the one who's buying in, am allowed to leave a mashkin, as long as I don't use the words, here is my mashkin. And he is allowed, he owns now his part in the Pesach. That means they halachically affect a sale. Because just like you can't do Mekach u'Memkar on Shabbos, you can't do it on Yom Tov either. So you do it on the first day Chol HaMoed. Okay. Says the Gemara.
Rabbi,
yes.
Just in today's calendar, Erev Pesach can never fall out on a Shabbos, correct?
Oh, yeah, today Erev Pesach can fall on Shabbos. Remember, B'dikas Chametz, putting it down the toilet, it doesn't happen that common. It happens. The first Seder is Motzei Shabbos. With all of the details, how do you have Shalosh Shudas? When you have Suda Shabbos with bread, you can't have matzah. It happens. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens. Okay. Now, this Rabbi Bar Chanan Abaya is connected to the Mishnah, but just a heads up, now that we quoted Rabbi Bar Chanan to Abaya, there's going to be other statements that are not going to be directly connected to our sugya. But statement number one is, Mishnah, why is it, as he was correctly medayik in the Mishnah, the words hashileni is permitted, and what words may not be used is halveini. So Amalei, Abai explained the Mishnah, hashileni, like we said, are words that are normally used when the item is going to be returned, which is why whenever someone uses the words of she'ilah in alone, it automatically implies a very short term loans are not written down. You know, can I have your pen? Mamish, please lend me your pen. And halavai, everyone should give back their pens. But no one writes that down because the kavanah is, I'm going to use it, I'm going to give it back. Therefore, liyasel michtav.
Is there a difference between hashileni and matanal menas lahachzer? Is there a difference?
No, you don't need to do any of that. That's also a transaction, by the way. Doesn't help. Taking a loan, just make a shinoi, use a word that reminds you it's short term. The word halveini, which is normally used when an item itself is going to be used, so it's going to be replaced. And then you have the rule at least 30 days. And therefore, normally, when people make a halva'ah, not only could it be written down, but we had chazals that it should be written down. And if you don't write it down, it's a terrible thing because you're giving people an opportunity not to pay it back. Therefore, we are more afraid that asal michtav. Now, it doesn't really solve the problem. Not everyone is so medayik. There are times that I am borrowing money for 30 days or for a year, and I'm not that learned. And I sometimes I use the words hashileni. And the lender doesn't say, no. The lender doesn't care what words you use. So in other words, the words hashileni sometimes are used for something more long-term. And when it's used in that context, even though they said hashileni, they write it down. So the kasha is, even though they had it's semantic, the Shabbos, just because you're using the words hashileni, maybe asal michtav. So Armalei, to which Abaya responds to Rabbi Bar Chanan, let's go with the Maharshal, we'll skip the brackets, we'll skip the parentheses, we're going down one line, that the Shabbos, Kivin the hashileni hu deshara rabbanan. You're right. During the week, people that are not that learned might not always be medayik, hashileni, halveni, but this din everyone knows that since on Shabbos Chazal says you may only use the words hashileni and halveni loy sharule, they don't allow you to use that word. So, you have to be careful what word. Why do I have to be careful? So it's a reminder. I have to be careful what words I use because Chazal were afraid that accidentally I'm going to write it down. Be careful what word you use. So all of these are reminders not to write it down. That works. So minker milsa v'yasel. Okay. And now we're going the same two Amiroim. Omar le Rav Bar Abayim Michti Omru Rabbanan. And a lot of these sugis we're going to have in Beitza. And this indeed is a quote from Masechtas Beitza. That kol mila de yontif. Even things that are allowed to be done, nevertheless, kama de efshel l'shanoi masheninon, we try to make a shinoi. So he asked him, hani nashi de malyin chatzbayo maya, women that go and they carry their buckets from the river back to their homes on yontif. And they're taka allowed to do it, but why don't they make a shinoi? Why isn't there a halacha for them to carry the water mit a shinoi? Now it's oichel nefesh, but do it with a shinoi. So answers Abayim mishum de lo yefsher. True, kol heicha de efsher. Here it's not efsher because heicha abdi. What exactly do you want? The malyan b'chatz barava. And if normally they take it in larger buckets to tell them make a shinoi by taking water on yontu b'chatz bazuta. It's nice that it's a Masechta Shabbos. Guys, you remember in Kuf Chav Zayin in the beginning of Perik Mefanim about moving the max 5 boxes? That was the Gavaldic question the Gemara had. Did the Mishnah mean the quantity of 5 boxes, but put it into smaller boxes? In other words, even though you have to make more trips, but each trip will have less weight? Or dafke, carry it in the largest containers, even though it's the heaviest, but you're getting over with it as soon as possible. That's exactly what he's saying. There is a concept of overly working because every pekel is very heavy. And then there's another way of feeling, I keep on going back and forth. So whichever shino you'll make, you depending how you relate to work, you might be imposing on her more work. We don't want to do that. If normally she schleps pitchers, bechatz faraba, and you're going to say, make a shino, carry it, bechatz vazuta, that's not good. Hakamaf should be ilucha. True, every pitcher will have less weight, but you are increasing her trips. That alone is more work. If normally she fills up her water b'chatz v'zuta, and you're going to say make a shinoi, which is lamala b'chatz v'rabba, so you'll make less trips, but still, komav shuba masli. But now, each trip, take less, but each one will weigh a lot more. Right? Kamus, echos, however you'll view this, and each side has a problem. Daf kuf mem ches amid beis. If you're going to say that nifrei sudra, okay, she should carry it in the same pitchers and the same buckets, but on Yontiv, cover it with the sudar. Sudar is again the tichel, the turban. Also the schita. No, you're carrying water. It's possible, probable that some of the water is going to go into the sudar, and then you're going to want to use the sudar. You're going to wring it out. If you're going to say, okay, don't use the sudar, mechasye benichtema, cover it with a lid. No. Because zilman de mitzak, sometimes if you're using now a bucket with a lid, then the cord that keeps them connected, as it was then, they were very flimsy, and they regularly tore or they broke, and maybe the asalim today, you're going to go and tie them up. And if you're doing a kesher, shal kayama, right, you're being mechalol doiraisa. If you're doing a maisa uman, she'ena shal kayama, maisa uman, you may be violating yisud derabana. Hilkach lo yafsher. And now the third statement from the same, to Abaya Tnan, it says, one may not clap one's hands, you may not beat the table, nor may you dance on Yom Tiv, and certainly not on Shabbos. Here we have again the Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi understands the meraktin is connected to dancing while you're singing, but the other two is connected to mourning. Tosfos here and in other places, second Tosfos says all these three are behaviors that people do during singing a song, And Chazal say, you may not do it on Yom Tov, certainly not on Shabbos. All of them, Shitas Tosfos, is because if you're going to be using a instrument, which is a drum, even though you're banging on the table. If you're going to bang the table, you're going to bang on a drum. Using a clay shiur is also because if it breaks, you might fix it. So the Mishnah says you're not allowed to do it. So frekt Rav Rava bar Avchanan v'hakachazinen da'avdin, we see, go to shul. We're going to speak about nowadays, now that Amos says it's mutter. But even then, you went into a shul, and during davening, people are singing, and people are clapping, people are banging on the table, and Hasidim are dancing. And no one is making a comment. Oh, so why? So he understood by the fact that no one is making a protest, it means that there's no longer an Isur. Then there was still an Isur. Again, we'll speak out soon how now there isn't, that Amah Paskins. So all the time counters Abaya, even in the times of Chazal, that this was Taka Asur. The fact that we don't protest doesn't mean that it became permitted. Chada Amar Rava, we have in the Mesilas Ashas Rabba, that another example that we just had above on Kuf Mem Aleph, when a person is sitting in a mavui that is closed from three sides, and they put the lechi there before Shabbos, right? They put the vertical beam in the front as a zecher. Here ends the mavui, there begins the Reshus Harabim. Nevertheless, we were told, don't sit over there with your stuff, because Dilma mig nadar lechefetz, maybe something that you're holding will roll out, and it's going to roll just a little millimeter in front of you, which is the Reshus Harabim. And you can't, when you're looking at the ground, you don't see any difference. And and you might bring it back, and that's an act of carrying. So that is the Isur Derabanan. And yet, says Abaye, there also we see, says the Bach, Noshe, he blames it on the women, that the Moisvei Chatzvayu, that they sit on their buckets, the Yosvan Apuma the Mavah, they shmooze, and some of them sit mamash at the entrance, and they're also and it's wrong. And the reason why people don't protest, that's okay, because of the klal Hanach li Yisrael. You got to make sure. You got to make sure to live Yidden alone, that if you know that people will not listen to your protest, it's better not to protest. Mutav shiur shoyin val yomei zidin. And just like we say that concept by the Isur that Rabbi said or that Rava said, and we don't protest against the people that are sitting on the edges of the Mavui, here also, even though it's Asur to clap your hands, to bang on the table, and to dance on Yom Tov and on Shabbos, we don't protest because they're not going to listen, and Hanach li Yisrael. Now, both of these gezeres that we did not protest against in the times of Chazal were Isuri D'Rabbanan. So the Gemara says that originally people thought, and that would fit with these two dinim. But if you see people violating an Isur D'Oraisa, there you have to protest. Says the Gemara, I want you to know that Belelli. No, Loishna b'Drabanan, Veloishna b'Doraisa. If people are not going to listen to the criticism against them, even if they're violating an Isur D'Oraisa, we still apply the concept of Hanach li Yisrael Mutev shiur shoyin. And how do I know that? Says the Gemara, Toha Toisvis or Toisefis the Yom Kippurim, adding to Yom Kippur in the beginning and at the end is the D'Oraisa. How is it D'Oraisa? Because in Parshas Emor, right, that's the famous Betisha lachodesh ba'erev. Betisha lachodesh. So many people are familiar with another Chazal. What, we're fasting on the 9th? Be. So the answer, no, eat on the 9th. And if you eat on the 9th, it's as if you fasted on the 9th and the 10th. That's one Chazal. There's another Chazal that you have to start fasting when it's still halachically the 9th. And that's called we add to Yom Kippur. By the way, we add not only in the beginning, we add at the end. But that is merumas in the pasuk. And yet, says the Gemara, that we see that people eat and drink mamash until the zman. By the way, the zman today is good. The zman today includes the Tosfos. But then they ate later. Is that ayah that we say Hanach li Yisrael even by Isur D'Oraisa? And to make two very important points, halacha l'maisa. Number one, that the poskim differentiate between an Isur D'Oraisa that's not written explicit, like Tosfos Yom Kippur. there we say Hanach li Yisrael, versus if someone is violating an Isser that's explicitly written about on the Torah, you have to make a protest. Obviously, do it the best way possible for them to be makabel. Right? You protest against it. That's number one. So there is some sort of nafkamina between different types of da'iraisis. And just to repeat that when it comes to the Isser of Lemesapkin, Lemetapkin, Lemeraktin, right, this is really in Beitza on Daf Lamed. So Tosfos over there writes, Tosfos already. I'm quoting the words of Tosfos. Umiu lididon shari, clapping your hands and banging on the table and dancing. Why the dafke biyameyen shahayu bikiyam lasis klei shir, says Tosfos. There shayach lemigzar. Abo lididon, we don't know how to make instruments. There's no gzeira. The Ramah paskins like Tosfos. Then the Ramah writes that some people are machmer to do it with a shinoi. Just to make a point that the Rebbe, by Fabrengens, when Rabbi Chadikov, Olav Shalom, he, for himself, would clap his hands sometimes with the shinoi, as many people do. The Rebbe Dafke did not want him to make the shinoi, whoever remembers, and the Rebbe would show him to clap normal, like the Ramah paskins. Now, it's just difficult to understand the shita of Tosfos, which becomes halacha, that normally by Gezeirus we don't say that. Normally, if the Chazal give a reason, even though the reason is no longer here, so what? Make a new minui. You need to have a bezin gadol himenu b'chachmu b'miyan to be mevatel it. There are very few exceptions. This is an exception. The question is why. I heard a good word that whenever Chazal made a Gezeirah that goes against a mitzvah, so there, in other words, adhering to this Gezeirah's Chazal, which we have to, will mean we're giving up on another mitzvah. There is where we say that if the reason of the Gezeirah goes away, not we, Tosfos has to say it, then it automatically goes away. Simcha Shabbos and Yom Tov is a mitzvah. So when you're singing and you're clapping and you're banging and you're dancing, it helps you feel the Simcha of Shabbos and Yom Tov. So since their Gezeirah went against another mitzvah, that is why, and that fits with the other exceptional times where Chazal already said, I'm talking about the Rishonim, that since the reason went away, then it's okay. Because it's going against a counter mitzvah. No, okay, weiter. The Mishnah said, Isha mechaverta, normally you can't do financial transactions. A woman realizes today is Shabbos, today is Yom Tov, I ran out of bread. She's allowed to borrow bread. Again, she has to use the word she'ela, even though it's really a halva because you plan to eat it up. That's a heked. Ooh, don't write it down. And even if you leave a mashkin, never use the words I'm leaving a mashkin. You can leave a mashkin and then make the cheshbon after Shabbos. Infers the Gemara, b'Shabbos hu da'aser. Right. In other words, aser meaning b'chlal. She can't say the words halveni, even with the Mishnah. She has to say the words hashileni. Aval b'choil shaper dami. But if a woman runs out of a loaf of bread, no problem during the week. If that is the case, then it's going to come out that our Mishnah is not like Hillel. Now, not like Hillel here doesn't mean like Shammai, which is a problem. It's really Hillel versus the Chachamim, which is okay. The Chachamim, it's okay, but we would prefer for the Mishnah to be even according to Hillel. Where's the Hillel? That's the famous saw, like we spoke on in the intro. It makes a lot of sense. If you're going to lend to me a loaf of bread, if when I give you back the loaf of bread, the price of bread went up, commodity for commodity, Hillel says, may not be done. Even though they speak about sa'a, which is a quantity of flour. Hillel says, I'm not only speaking about flour, even if it's just a loaf of bread. You have to say, how much value does it have now? It's $2, then give me back $2, then you're okay. The Chachamim hold that a loaf of bread is so insignificant, that's not called ribis, even if it's going to be worth more money. So is it that our Shema Yukru Chitim, that's all Hillel, Benimsu Bois L'Dei ribis? So says the Gemara, no, Afilu Tema, our Mishnah follows Hillel. Even according to Hillel, again, we're not speaking about a halva, right? The bread is going to be returned right after Shabbos or Yom Tov. He's speaking about a day or two. When you live in a like here, where there's no inflation yet, so then it's called Ba'asra, the Kitz Dame, then we're not going to be choishish that in 1 or 2 days the price of bread will go up. Even Hillel will be moided that you could borrow a loaf of bread to return the loaf of bread. The case of Hillel was, Brazil before the 90s. Every day, there was 1% inflation. Every day you went to the market, everything had a new price on it. Amazing. It was good for business. My father said that, all of a sudden, because then you were motivated to buy today. He would tell a person, if you don't buy the curtains today, tomorrow you're going to pay more. It somehow motivated people to buy, even though the money was worth nothing. But still, it's a good rate. Only Ba'asra, where there's so much inflation, that is where Hillel said you can't even borrow and lend a kicker for a kicker. Okay. Now the Mishnah says, so then again, you can leave a mashkin without using the word mashkin. Just leave a cloak and then make the cheshbon afterwards. Says the Gemara, this is the big machlokes here. Itmar we learned. When you have such a halva, it's called halvas yantiv. And by the way, the same thing Shabbos. Rav Yosef says, Oy gewalt loy nitna li tava. You cannot take, the lender can never take the borrower to a bezdin to demand payment. You're lending it to him, you have to feel that he's going to pay it back, which is like a way a mashkin can be taken. But because it's like a vague loan, details are not spoken about. You have to be careful what words you use. To begin with, it's a loan that can never be collected in basin. Rabbi says no, you lent the item, you lent the bread, you lent a pitcher of wine. Yes, nitna li tava. And now the Gemara explains, why does Rabbi Yosef say le nitna li tava? The amra, the first wide line, nitna li tava, like it would make sense. Then we're afraid that asi lemichtav. Guys, that makes so much sense. Listen, by a halva, that's the rule. When I lend you something for a long term, you know why I write it down? Not because I don't trust you. I'm afraid I'm going to forget. No, it's by a halachically halva. The lender likes writing it down. By a she'ila, you're not afraid that you're going to forget. So normally you don't write it down. However, what's going to happen if I'm afraid that the borrower will deny it? And then I write it down. Listen, I wrote it down. Not that he signed it. I'm not speaking about writing it down in a way where you're going to use that document in a court. No, it's whenever there's a fear that something might go wrong, that's more of a reason to write it down. Whenever Rabbi Yosef says you cannot collect it anyway, you have to rely on the borrower. I'm not going to write it down. If anything, take a mashkin, but writing it down doesn't do anything. Rabbi says, no, you have to be allowed to collect it in court. This might cause you to write it down. People know you can't write on Yom Tov. People know you can't write on Shabbos. Rabbi says if you will not be allowed to collect this loan in court, people will never loan. And people won't have food on Yom Tov if they run out of food. The that you cannot take this to a din trader if need be, then people will never land. And which is the whole reason why the Chachamim made the exception, allowing us to do these sort of financial transactions to make sure that if you run out of food on Yom Tov, then you are able to solve it. Okay, says the Gemara from our Mishnah, we're going to try to resolve which one is right. Says the Gemara, like Rabbi Yosef, that loy nitna li tava. So indeed, the only solution is a mashkin. And Eli Amrat, like Rabbi, that yes, nitna li tava, even leaving a mashkin is also financial dealings. But leaving a mashkin in itself is not so kosher. So why would we allow that to happen? Give him the kadayain, give the kicker, and then if anything happens, but let's say, this can be done by having people witness it. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a refutation. Many times people say, I don't mind lending you money. I don't want to have to go to court with you. That's the beauty of a mashkin. Amar, because the lender says, I don't want to have to make litigation against you. I don't want to have to stand in front of Dayanim. I know that I could, but I don't want to. And because of that, again, the Chazal wanted for people to be able to borrow food on Yom Tov for Simchas Yom Tov. So to make sure that lenders will be willing to lend, they were matir the usage of a mashkin.
Rabbi,
yes.
Just a quick clarification. What's the process of going to court to say I lent this guy a loaf of bread or whatever it was on Yom Tov, and he owes it? So it's Eidim. That's what it means.
Yeah.
Okay.
Masav Ravidi Barovin, Mishnah Shvis, Hashechet Saporo, B'chilka b'Rosh Hashanah. Bechlal, it was common that when people slaughtered animals, there was no refrigeration. You know when you slaughtered an animal? When you had enough group buy-in. So he said like this. So let's say I own a cow, Marshall. I have many people that are saying, oh, they are part, they are part, they are part. And now I shecht it. If that happened on Rosh Hashanah, if it turns out, it's amazing. Number one, Shvius relinquishes loans. Number two, when is Shvius Mishamet according to this Tanach? At the end of the year. Number three, Rosh Hashanah, we never know, Bisman Abayis, if what we call Rosh Hashanah is Taka Aleph Tishrei, maybe if no Edom are going to come, it's going to turn out it's Lamed Elul. Lamed Elul, if we're speaking about Elul is a Shemitah year, this is speaking about the year right after Shemitah. So there was this Chevraman who so to say, loaned the money because if I shecht my cow for you, it's a loan. I'm expecting for you to pay me the value after Yom Tov, after Rosh Hashanah. If the Chodesh turns out to be Ma'ubar, it means that it turned out that the day that he shechted it was not Aleph Tishrei, it was Lamed Elul, so then Meshamet. So then, my friends, I lost my, that's it, the loan got canceled. The Imlav, this is all the Mishnah. If Taka Edom came, and it turned out that today is Yom Tiv, it's no longer Shemitah, then Eina Meshamet. Now, L'chura, both from the Reisha and from the Sefer, we can make a deal. Says the Gemara. The Eloi Nitna Likava, if you, Rabbi Yosef, is right, that even a loan that's made on Yom Tiv can never be collected, why does the Mishnah write in the Reisha that if it turned out that the Chodesh was Mu'ubar, then the loan is canceled? And before you knew that it's Mu'ubar, let's assume that it's Taka Rosh Hashanah because you begin the day L'chumra behaving like it's Rosh Hashanah. It's a loan that you're giving on Yom Tov. But Chlal, you cannot collect it. My Meshamet, it was anyways uncollectible. The Gemara says, no, that's not a kash. No, it's Shana Hassan, the Mishnah begins in the Reisha, that if it turned out that today was a Mu'ubar, the Igloyi Milsa de Choilhu, and therefore, now that it became clear that it is the year of Shemitah, that's what the Mishnah means to say, then the Chal, there's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to talk about because you cannot collect it. Because Shemitah is Mishamet. Now, also don't forget something else, my friends, which is really what the Gemara is going to speak out. If it's not Shemitah, there is a loan. Rabbi Yosef is not saying that the loan is not a loan. All Rabbi Yosef is saying is that you cannot collect it. So the Mishnah begins by saying, if it turns out that it's Chodesh Mu'ubar, then the whole thing is canceled out. But
now you can't collect it. You can't collect it in court, but you still could collect it. The guy owes you money.
Danny. Okay, we're getting to that. But then let's go weiter. Then it says, but if a taka came out that today was Aleph Tishrei, not Mu'ubar, so then Einoi Meshamet. So let's be medayik on these words. I Amra Bishleima like me, Rabba, Nitna Litava, Haina Viktani, Einoi Meshamet. Because I can collect it in court. But Eli Amra, Taloi Nitna Litava, then again, what the Bach says, then my Einoi Meshamet, what does it mean? So the Gemara answers, Danny, what you're saying. Okay, it's not canceled. The loan is not canceled because it wasn't Shemitah. You cannot collect it. Nevertheless, the loan is there. And therefore, the shakil, it means that you can't collect it in court, but if the Chaverim are being honest and they give you the money, then you take it. But we're building up to something, Danny. What does that mean? That by Shemitah you can't take it? I'm asking you, if I lend you money and the Shemitah year comes and you give it to me, what, I'm not allowed to take it? So, Michlal, the Reisha Iyavle Lo Shakil? And why not? L'chayra, Shemitah means that I'm not allowed to collect. Lo Yigoish, I'm not collecting. You're coming to me. So the Gemara says, no, there is a difference. Even when it comes to a loan, like Rabbi Yosef holds, that cannot be collected in court, you can't compare that to Shemitah. Even though by Shemitah, eventually, out of Beis Din, if the borrower insists, you could take it. But there's a difference, as the Gemara explains. If the loan was given on the Shemitah year, that's the Reisha, Chodesh Mu'ubar, and the borrowers, the Chavedim, want to pay you the Baal HaParam, you have to first tell them, I relinquish. If they say, I know you relinquish, but I want to pay you nevertheless, you are allowed to take it. But you have to first say, Neshamatani. when it comes to a halva that's made on Yom Tov, even l'shitas Rabbi Yosef, that you can't collect it in court, if they come and give it to you, you never even have to say, I relinquish. If someone wants to pay back that debt, that shvius went over, he has to first react the lender by saying, I relinquish. But then you kabul mimenu. How do you know that the lender has to say first, I relinquish? The pasuk in the A, where the pasuk says, V'zed dvar hashmita, al-pipshat means this is the topic of shmita. The drush is words, dibur. You have to say the words, I'm being meshamet, I relinquish. Okay. Says Gemara, Rabbi Abiyah shakal mashkaina. Rabbi Abiyah lent on Yom Tov, and he took a mashkin. Rabbi Barula, he didn't want to take a mashkin on Yom Tov. Why didn't he want to take a mashkin? Because taking a mashkin is also bechlal asur. It's memtzay chefzecha, but it's part of doing business. Nervous then, he knew that you're not allowed to write. How is he going to get his money back? So he had another technique, which was ma'arim erume. He employed a harama. What's the harama? Taiches Rashi, Gavaldik. He lent a kadayayin. After Yom Tov, he didn't go to his neighbor and say, please return it to me. He was afraid his neighbor is going to deny, then he won't be able to collect it. He would go to his neighbor and say, can you do me a favor? Can you lend me some money? He wouldn't mention the prior loan that he gave. He would become a borrower. Oh, I lend you money. Then he would tell his neighbor, you know what? Since I lent you wine and now I have your money, it's a wash. You know, that's what he did to make sure that he gets his money back. Then the Mishnah says, weiter, v'chein erev Pesach, that what? That if erev Pesach is on Shabbos, that if someone did not yet have a group, he was not part of a minyan over a Koren Pesach, here you have to own it. That's buying. It's not borrowing. You can do that. Rabbi Yechanan, says Rabbi Yechanan, that again, even though we have a Mishnah, a klal, that because of Shvus, normally you may not be magdish an animal as a korban on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Magdish adam pischa b'Shabbos, the chagigos b'Yom Tov. As we'll see in the Gemara, that these two korbanos have to be brought boy by yom. You have to bring a korban Pesach on Yud Dalid, and if it's on Shabbos, you bring it on Shabbos. Chagigas Yom Tov is brought on the first day of Yom Tov. And that's his klal, even though it goes against the words of the Mishnah, but he says that if the hakrava is doicha Shabbos, then you can be magdish. So the Gemara wants to say, l'chu'ura, you can back up Rabbi Yechanan from our Mishnah. Because it says in our Mishnah, v'chein erev Pesach b'Yerushalayim, shchali is b'Shabbos, manicha telisa yeslei, v'noy telas pischon oisim, echashmalacha Yom Tov, and l'chu'ura, you're being magdish it, right? You're buying it on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, no, there's no proof from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is speaking about a case, other people were already magdish the animal. The animal is already mugdash. You're only buying in. Yeah, you're doing a transaction. You're buying, but you're not being magdish because the animal was mugdash. The mi'ikara mikadosh v'koyin. This question is not really a question. This question is, again, we do bring a raya from these dinim to Rabbi Yechanan because it says in Beitza, Ein nimnim al behema b'tchilu b'yantif, that when we're speaking about, again, this concept of group, right, of group purchasing, you may not make a group purchase lachatchila on yantif, because again, that's violating the isur of doing business on Yom Tif, and the fact that you are allowed to buy in when it comes to the Koren Pesach. So again, we're being matir you to do it for the mitzvah. So the Gemara says no. I'll go more than that. Shani hacha in our Mishnah, kiven the ragel etzloi, what normally will happen, I'm not even buying in. How am I not even buying in? Because when my chaverim, when they already designated the animal for their Koren Pesach, and every year prior I was part of their group, and I did not yet join them, they already have me in mind. Because what's really happening here is a much lesser problem. If the animal is already mugdish, they already have me in mind. And therefore it's mutter, you can't prove to Rabbi Yechanan that you can be magdish an animal. No, that if a person has no Korban Pesach. There is no group on a Korban Pesach. Today is Erev Pesach on Shabbos. I can go to the shepherd from whom I always get my animal and get an animal and be magdish it. So this is Arayah to Rabbi Yechanan. This is not a kasha. This is Arayah to Rabbi Yechanan. Also not Arayah. It may be that since every year I go to the same shepherd, so that shepherd was already magdish it before Shabbos. It says in the Braisa of Magdish Ktani, it only means is that when the person takes the animal, since he never did it himself, the shepherd did it for him, he has to say the words, Hegdish Iluye Midrabanan. He has to make there's a rabbinic obligation for him to say the word Hegdish. So you can't prove anything to Rabbi Yechanan, but Rabbi Yechanan didn't stand. Which is that even though there's a Mishnah that says that a person may not, Mishum Shvuz, be Magdish an animal on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, if that animal has to be brought today, then you are allowed to be Magdish it. And it says in a Stam Mishnah, in Psachim and in Beitza, that loy makadishin, v'loy ma'arichin, v'loy machnimin, v'loy makbim trumus u'maisris, kol eilu b'yomtiv, amru kavuchayim b'Shabbos. The Mishnah says you can't do it. Says the Gemara, loy kashem, kan. The statement that we're learning over here is b'choyvay shekvu olam zman. Like we mentioned, Pesach has to be brought today on Shabbos. And therefore, like the Rashi used the words, Rabbi Yechanan had his logic, Kiven da'hakra vasan doicha, kidushasan doicha. Kan, the Mishnah you quoted from Sachem and Beitza, that has a klal loy magdishin, that's b'choyva she'en kavol zman. But if kavol zman, if you can offer it, right, if you can be makriv of it, then for sure you can be magdishit. Gavaldig, God willing, to be continued.
Shkoyach. Thank you.
Shkoyach.
Have a good day.
Yeah, have a great day.
Oh, come on.